he went. Yes, Parashat Vayetzei is and he went. This is the Torah portion. I like to call it There and Back Again. It's kind of like a J.R. Tolkien novel. Where, the Hobbit was also called There and Back Again. So this is where Jacob is fleeing from his brother Esav, who said he wanted to kill him, and goes to Uncle Laban with the dual purpose of escaping persecution and finding a bride. Spends 20 years there and then comes back. That's the whole Torah portion, there and back again. So in this portion, as I am wont to do, I'll give you a brief overview. In Genesis 28, we have him going towards this place. It's kind of interesting because in the Torah portion it says ha-makom, which means the place. It's the definitive article. It almost seems like he happens upon this place by accident as the sun is going down, and he decides he's going to, make camp there and spend the night because it's getting dark. But the text keeps using this phrase, hamakom, hamakom, hamakom. And then, some strange things happen there. He sees the vision of the ladder and sets up a standing stone and this kind of stuff. Says this is the house of God, has a vision. And then as he leaves the Holy Land and enters the northern Syria to visit Uncle Laban, he comes to a well. And there's a stone on the well, and there's 4 flocks of sheep, and he meets Rachel there for the first time. And then in Genesis 29 also, we have him meeting his cousins and getting a job with Uncle Laban, the scoundrel. And then 29 also, he gets deceived by Uncle Laban, switching out the bride. He wanted Rachel, but he ends up with Leah, and then he gets Leah as well, and a couple of extras thrown in, Bilhah and Zilpah. And then we have a childbirthing competition, some selective sheep breeding, and building a nest egg for the family. This is him. These wives are heavy and fierce in the competition.
Did you make that?
I made that up, yeah.
I love that.
They get jealous of each other.
Yeah, they're very jealous of each other, and they're a childbirthing competition. Yeah, he's in a relatively short period of time. He's got 11 sons and 1 named daughter, and probably a whole bunch more daughters that are not named in the text.
And maybe not 9 months apart. They could maybe be the same age.
Yeah, they could be overlapping.
They're all having kids at the same
14
time.
years to get the 2 wives that he...
Yeah, it took him,
You could do it with different
6 years for a time with Leah.
Didn't work that way.
So yeah, absolutely. And then of course we have him peeling strips of bark from the trees and kind of getting these sheep to, well, he's not doing anything, I think we'll discover. And then making a deal with Laban to try to get some money for himself. Where shortly thereafter in chapter 31, he begins to feel unwelcome. He receives a confirmation from God, get out of here. And he runs away with his family and all of his goods, and then has a confrontation with Uncle Laban just before he leaves that place and gets back to the Holy Land. And then in chapter 32, it's literally just the first 2 verses of chapter 32 are part of this portion. And some unexpected allies, I will call them, Mahanaim, and we'll deal with that in a moment. It's kind of fascinating. The first thing that we want to discuss is him leaving the Holy Land, and as he's about to leave the Holy Land, he happens upon the place. And you'll notice in your text that right at the beginning of our Torah portion here in chapter 28, I think it's verse 12 is where it starts. No, it starts in verse 10. It says that he went out from Beersheba and towards Haran, and he lighted on a certain place. And then you'll see that phrase, that place, and that place, and this place. Well, in the Hebrew, it's all the same word, hamakom, the place, which is unusual since it's the definitive article. But what's interesting is that in regards to this place, it appears, this hamakom phrase appears multiple times, and you can see from the text that something special is going on there for certain. I mean, he says that he takes a pillow of a stone from the place and rests his head on it, and then he has a vision, a dream in the night regarding this ladder that is going from heaven to earth. And then he, of course, wakes up in the morning and says, "Man, this is God's house. This is an awesome place." And he says, "This is God's house." And he takes that stone that apparently he had been using for a pillow, and he stands it up and pours oil on it. And then, some interesting things happen. But what's fascinating is that this place, he calls it Beth-El, which literally means the house of God, but it used to be called Luz. And it is theorized that this place would become where the temple was built. That is the common understanding. And it makes sense just because of some of the symbolism that happens in that place. And there are, I'm pretty confident, you'll have to double check me on this, just make a note to yourself, but I'm pretty confident that there are several Beth-Els in the Bible. When you see Beth-El, it's not always talking about the same place. There are a couple of different ones. Double check that, but I'm pretty certain that that's the case. And so, because we know other Beth-Els in the Bible which are not Jerusalem, but because there are multiples, and this place has some special something happening here, it is supposed that this is the place where the temple would eventually be built. And what's interesting about this is that he sees this ladder. And I know we talked about this a couple of years back, 3 years or maybe 4 now, from when we were studying Genesis, that the text says that this ladder was set up in heaven, which is weird because it almost seems like, when you're setting up a ladder, you put it on the ground and it goes up into the sky. This ladder appears to be set in heaven and going down towards the ground, which is unusual. The ladder...
My Bible says it's just the opposite.
Yeah, then that's why translations, changed translations are very critical, because you'll see in several translations, a good one at least, is trying to... See, they don't want to confuse you. Yeah, they don't want to confuse you, and so you kind of have to get a literal translation or just look at it in the Hebrew itself, a transliteration, but that makes it difficult to read, because it doesn't read well in English, but you get a more true meaning of the text. This ladder appears to be set from heaven down to earth, which is interesting.
Makes more sense.
It does, because this is a God-initiated thing. This is not man, something on the earth trying to get to God. This is God reaching out to man, which that just makes so much sense to us, and to anybody who's serious about God and studies His Word, knows that God is about seeking man. He wants man to seek God, but unfortunately often man doesn't. And can't to a degree, yeah, absolutely. Doesn't mean they shouldn't try, but there's that barrier, that's in place, the sin that so easily entangles us. But yeah, it's interesting that this ladder appears to be set up in heaven and going down to the earth. And then there's messengers going up and down, which is seemingly indicating its purpose. What do you think I mean by that? These messengers going up and down, indicating the purpose of the ladder. What would you say the purpose of the ladder is?
Sounds like the angels going up and down.
Yeah, it does seem to
From
say.
the presence of God to communicate
Maybe they're
with
loaded
Jacob.
produce.
Yeah, it seems they could be
Maybe the loaded produce. They can
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah, it could be that they're translating messages back and forth between
So,
heaven and earth.
people die,
Yeah, you never know. But it seems like this is a messenger, and I think what you want to think of here, not necessarily that certainly the angels are important who are traveling up and down, but think about their purpose. Their purpose is they're carrying messages, and so this ladder, its purpose is messaging. It's a message carrier.
But also Jehovah stood above there. and said, I am Jehovah, the God of your father. And he was talking, sounds like he was talking directly to Jacob.
Yeah.
Not using the angels at that moment.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, when he appears to Jacob in the text, in the dream, yeah, he's speaking directly to Jacob. And what's interesting also, and I had to check this because I had heard somebody say it, but I didn't know whether it was true or not, but it appears that it is. There's a strange personal pronoun attached to this ladder. The ladder is not an it, it's a he, which is even stranger. The rabbis acknowledge this, but they're not exactly sure what to do with it. I know we know what to do with it, because what if the ladder is a he? What is that What is that? It's the Messiah.
Where are you seeing this he?
Well, in Hebrew, the word he is who. And I thought when I first looked at this in Hebrew that I was missing something, because it didn't seem to me, I didn't look terribly carefully, but you might, if you look a little more carefully, you might see it. But here's the thing, it's not a who attached to the word ladder. It's some type of a weird thing in Hebrew, which you know that I'm not a Hebrew scholar, that there's something attached to the ladder that is puzzling to the rabbis, which seems to indicate the ladder is a he. But it's not your traditional Hebrew word who, which is the definitive pronoun for a person. It's something else.
The conjugation of an adjective.
Angela knows more about the Hebrew language than I do. She has suggested it's probably a conjugative form of a verb or an adjective that is indicating this personal pronoun.
That makes it so much clearer.
That makes it so much clearer, doesn't it? I know. I totally understand. But you don't necessarily need to take my word for it. I didn't take someone else's word for it. I looked it up and it was having a little trouble with it, so I thought, well, I'll go to some of the rabbinic works and see what they say. And sure enough, there it was. They said, this is a mystery. We're not sure exactly what to do this. They proposed some ideas, but I think that our idea regarding this ladder being the Messiah is a good indication, especially some of the things that happen in this place. I mean, you got, the ladder coming down from heaven, indicating its source, its origin. You got the message. It's 4 messages, coming up and down. It's got this strange personal pronoun attached. It's a he, and then of course you got this stone, which he sets up.
What did you use to look it up?
The Hebrew interlinear.
Okay.
Yeah. Angela.
If you guys want to look into that a little bit, we went over this in pretty good detail on the message we have online called Children of God, I think.
Oh yes,
We talked about
yeah.
We went so far as to say that this ladder. Remember when we talked about it being a spiral?
A twinned helix.
Yeah.
Yes.
Twin helix. It looks like DNA. It looks like the letter Het, and we were talking
Yeah.
specifically about the letter Het,
Yeah.
and that the whole thing with the 23 and the 46 and the number of chromosomes and
Yep.
the seed of the woman, and then I'm just you have to listen to the whole hour and whatever it is, but that basically what you've got here is an information exchange,
Mm-hmm.
and that this idea of it looking like a twin helix, like DNA, because DNA is information passed on to the cells so the body does what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
And Yeshua is that information from God,
Right.
so that the body, his body, us, we reproduce the way we
Yeah, Angela took that metaphor to its extreme with the twin helix ladder idea and transmitting information in a more genetic fashion, which was quite fascinating. So yeah, that's online if you want to take a look at that. That was an individual standalone teaching that you can.
With that kind of a reference right there.
Yeah,
Genesis 28.
it's talking about this in particular.
Yeah, it started with, it was about the letter Het, but the paleo is one of those.
Yeah,
And so we went quickly to Jacob's ladder
right.
and discussed that in a lot of detail.
Yeah. So take a look at that if you want to do a deep dive on Jacob's ladder. It's quite fascinating. And then of course you can compare this with the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 51. I will actually read that to you here. This is in relation to Nathanael having been under the fig tree or something, and Yeshua says, I saw you under the fig tree, and he's like, oh, no kidding, and he's like, oh, you're impressed by that. So Yeshua said to him, because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you now believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, I am telling you the truth. From here forward, that's a strange word that's hard to describe. From now forward, or starting now, I'm not sure. You will see the heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Fascinating thing, which frankly, a lot of Christian scholars are not sure what to do with that passage.
On the Son of Man, if the ladder was
That's
the
right.
Messiah.
That is what Jacob
I
saw.
think that
Heaven
is...
opened and messengers were ascending.
Messengers...
and descending, those two key
Okay, so here's the question, though. What is Yeshua talking about? Clearly, he's making a reference back to Genesis chapter 28 when Jacob sees this vision. But what is he talking about to Nathanael? Is he talking about the Mount of Transfiguration? Because we do have at least one story where the angels come down and minister to him. But we're not certain that that was in the desert, when he was tempted of the serpent. But I don't know that anybody saw that. So what's...
40 days in the wilderness.
Yeah, that's when he was tempted by the adversary. But none of the disciples were there to see that, as far as we know.
Two of the disciples were there to witness the transfiguration.
Two of the disciples were there to witness the Mount of Transfiguration, but that says that Moses and Elijah showed up. Could those be messengers? Sure, they certainly could be. It's fascinating that of Moses and Elijah, one in the historical narrative died and the other did not, was translated. So it's uncertain regarding what Yeshua is saying to Nathanael. What is he going to see? I'm telling you the truth, that you'll see heaven open and the sun. It could be a prophecy about the future, but it seems like he was saying to him, you're going to see something. It's uncertain what that was exactly.
There's no record of later on anything like this happening.
No, it's a rather mysterious thing.
Usually God will give a thing like this.
Yeah.
And then later on we'll see where it
Picks up again, yeah.
It'll almost give you a
Right.
perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times you'll see that, but in this case, that's why a lot of Christian scholars are kind of puzzled by that passage in particular. It doesn't seem to have been fulfilled, at least not in the text that we have. John does say, hey, Yeshua did so many things that if they were all written about, the whole world wouldn't be able to contain them. So maybe it's one of the things he left out. But it seems weird that he would have referenced it and then left out the fulfillment of that. So it could be a prophetic thing that happens later on. Not sure. It's a bit of a mystery. So there's... And then you've got this anointed standing stone, which also speaks so clearly to me about Yeshua, being this anointed chief cornerstone, the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense. There's just so much metaphorical imagery in this section that really speaks about not only the temple, but the Messiah specifically. So it's quite fascinating. So I would say that's definitely symbolic of the chief stone or the cornerstone. Now, what's interesting to me is there are several examples of people setting up a stone. I can't remember the Hebrew word for a standing stone, but Jacob sets up one. When he leaves, there's probably a chiasm in there somewhere, because at the very beginning of this Torah portion, he has this experience where he sets up a stone and pours oil on it. It is not the Hebrew word for anointed, Mashiach. It just says he pours oil on it. It doesn't use the form of anointing. He's clearly anointing the stone, but the word anointed is not used. It just says he pours oil on it. But then at the end of this Torah portion, when he's leaving the land of Haran, he and Uncle Laban set up another standing stone.
That was an altar, wasn't it?
They also set up an altar and did sacrifices for this covenant that they made. Yeah, right.
Which means if you go beyond this point,
right,
everything you own belongs to me,
right,
and vice versa.
Yep. So they made a covenant to not cross this boundary for harm for each other. So there's two of these things, and I believe that there's another one. during the time of Joshua. But then you have these commandments in Leviticus, I believe it is, where God says that you are to tear down all of the standing stones, same Hebrew word, of the Canaanites. And he says, do not set up standing stones, which is an abomination unto me. So that's just something to make a note to yourself is regarding maybe a study that you can look at in the future regarding standing stones, because there are a couple of the biblical patriarchs which do it, but then at the time of Moses, God is giving very explicit command, do not set up standing stones.
I mean, Abraham did it, didn't he?
I don't know about Abraham setting up a standing stone. He might have.
Stones, the pagans? Or did they just leave them
Yeah, that's probably true that the pagans would have, hewn their
And
stones.
other ones like Joshua's in the middle of the river, they
Yeah, right, right,
altar,
When they
12
crossed.
stones,
right.
they crossed the Jordan River.
Yeah. So it's possible. There's some type of a mystery there, and I would just say make a note of it and take a
Isn't there
look.
place before when they went into the Red Sea where they put...
No, that was the Jordan River. That's what Jerry's talking about. Yeah.
Right
That's
in
a-
the middle of it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Fascinating. So there is Genesis 28, and then of course he says, which is the weirdest thing. After he has this vision, he says, "This is none other than the house of God, and if you indeed will go with me and provide food for me and clothing and return me to this place, then you will be my God, and I will give you a tenth. I will tithe." Which is fascinating. Super weird that Jacob would. It's almost like he's.
Deal with God.
Yeah, it's almost like he's trying to make a deal.
This was after Melchizedek, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So maybe he was going a little bit like that, remembering back.
It's
what his
possible,
father had
yeah.
told him about.
It's possible, but it just seems weird that if we imagine Jacob to be this great man of God and such, that he's saying, "Oh wow, I just had a vision from God, and if what you say is true, and you really are God, and you take me safely on my journey and provide everything I need, and then see me back to my father's house, then you will be my God." Which is a little weird. It's just a weird statement. It's almost like
Or
he's...
it's just the way they word it.
No, it's literally what it says in the Hebrew. Is that he seems to be...
You can believe in God and totally trust God, but not be certain what He wants you to do, and not certain that what you saw is what you thought you saw, and so you put almost like a fleece out there.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. This is
Settle
definitely...
in my heart type of
Sure.
thing.
And this is and that's the whole issue, I think, is that we're looking at this and thinking, well, isn't it already settled in his heart? I mean, you would think, since he's one of the patriarchs, but
Right.
it's not necessarily so. And I think that there's...
growing up in a Christian home, which I didn't saw the Lord work like
Sure.
miracle after miracle,
Sure.
literally,
Yeah.
Like Jacob, you mean?
at human needs, not some outlandish thing.
Sure, sure,
And then to still sometimes wonder,
sure.
not so much these older days as I get older and have more to fall back on in my memory what the Lord has done.
Yeah.
But when I was in my
Bless
teens and stuff,
Sure. Well, what's interesting too is according to what we know regarding Jacob's life, remember that when he left the land of Israel to go to Uncle Laban's, he was nearly 70 years old. He's not a young man.
He's 90.
It's like his
90
grandfather.
now, Bob.
Yeah, he was older when he went to Haran to find his wife. And so, what am I bringing out here?
he put in a lot
No,
of years as
it
an
doesn't.
electrician.
This is the chronology that Bible experts have kind of figured out based
But
upon.
it's not stated like it is with
It's
Abraham.
no, it's not stated clearly how old he is when he went there and stuff like that. No, it's surmised. Angela?
That if word, I think we might not want to. What's that thing where you take the modern understanding of the word and apply it to
Yeah.
that if word is a complicated word. I'm not sure that he's saying.
Is he saying sense? Yeah, some people have tried to translate it a little bit differently too.
That's not, no net.
Are you talking about the Hebrew meaning?
The if, yeah.
Yeah.
The eem word is there's a lot of nuances
Sure,
there. So
sure.
don't think he's saying, if you do this,
Oh, that
I'll
would
do
change
this
it.
for you. 'Cause
Yeah.
That would
I'm not
definitely
sure
change
that's-
it.
Sure.
I'm not sure that's what's happening there, so.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm not an expert in Hebrew, but what I do say is that even among the rabbis, they're puzzled by this statement. they're reading it as if as well. So that when they comment on this section, there's, of course, you know how it is with the rabbis. They're always making excuses for the patriarchs, saying they didn't really mean what what you thought they meant and stuff like that. But in this case, it is common to read it as if, and that he's putting out some kind of fleece or testing God in some way, and it's just a weird statement. So there's that. In Genesis 29, he comes to this well where he's going to meet Rachel the first time. And this is interesting because we have 3 examples of a woman at a well in the Hebrew Bible. We have Eliezer, which we just saw a few chapters ago, when Abraham sent him to get a wife for Isaac. We have Jacob, which is happening here, and then we have Moses, when he goes and meets Zipporah for the first time in the land of Midian. Those are 3 situations where a guy meets a girl at a well. We also know that Yeshua met a woman at a well in John chapter 4. There's some interesting parallels between every single one of these instances of a woman at a well that happen at every single one of them. It's quite fascinating, and I put them up on this slide for you so you could take a look at them. In every case, there is a trip to a distant place where the subject stops at a well. He then encounters a woman. There's some type of weird scene with water, generally heroic. If you'll remember with Eliezer, the woman waters the camels, just some superhuman feat of lots of water hauling. Yeah. And then with Jacob, he rolls this seemingly giant stone off of the top of this well by himself in order to water Rachel's sheep. And then Moses gets into a fight and drives off some shepherds to help Zipporah water Yithro's sheep. And then what do you say that might be some weird water scene with Yeshua at this well? He's talking to a prostitute saying, I will give you living water.
Who is also an enemy to his people.
Right. So but every single instance is something very, very similar. The woman leaves and goes and reports back to her family, and then the man is brought to that family and a marriage ensues. Every single time.
Not with Yeshua, did it?
Does it though? Does it? That's a question. If this pattern holds true, does this all track? This tracks very well and very easily with Eliezer and Jacob and Moses, but does it track with Yeshua? Well, he's on his way up north to the Galilee and stops by a well. He does stop at the well. He does encounter this woman. Some type of a weird scene happens with water at the well. The woman does go back to the city and report, not to her family, but I suppose her acquaintances. The man is brought to the family. He does go and stay with them for 2 days, it says. And then does a marriage ensue? Huh?
The fields are white.
Yeah. Is this in...
coming out to become in covenant.
The Samaritans do come out...
It's a covenant that ensues, not a marriage. Maybe you should...
Okay, yeah, you could potentially broaden it and say it's not always a marriage covenant, but it is a covenant, so that's certainly possible. And if this...
access to that water?
Yeah.
It's like all these figures are giving the bride access to the water.
Except in the case of Eliezer, where she is giving him access to the water. It's a little backwards. His 10 camels, yes.
10 unclean animals.
True that. Okay, so that's an interesting comment. She is providing water to his 10 unclean animals, which could indicate goyim, Gentiles. So in the case of Yeshua with this woman at the well, you could suggest, for the sake of discussion, that perhaps the woman is a representative of Gentiles being grafted in, becoming part of the bride. So that's not too far of a stretch to make that case there. But it's interesting that these same steps happen at each one of these well/woman scenarios. Jerry?
I think when he told her that he would give her living water, that pretty much cinches up the grafted in part.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think that it would be interesting to look at the others and see if grafted
If there's an element of grafted in, yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's through marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a fascinating scene. Yeah. So he does perform a feat. So he then goes back and meets with her family, and a deal is struck for 7 years of service. And I love this portion where it says that he served Laban for 7 years, but it seemed like 7 days because of his love for Rachel. That speaks to me, because
Me too.
it really well, it speaks to me in a sense, not for the tenderness of the moment necessarily, but just about the how attitude is so important.
Yeah.
That attitude and your perspective on things can really make a difference. So you know how they say that time flies when you're having fun, but that same principle applies. You can,
When you get your eye on the goal.
when you got your eye on the goal, what's happening around you can kind of fade away. And I think that really speaks to our end goal perspective that we're supposed to have. And so many of the apostles' writings in the New Testament will talk to us about keeping our eye on the prize and keeping our minds on the things that will be revealed to us at the revelation of the Messiah, so that we can weather and endure the difficulties that we face in life. Angela?
Well, the 7, to me, just thinking numbers, speaks to the 7 days, 7,000 years.
Sure.
And when he says this year seemed as a day, I'm thinking, well, 1,000 years seems as a day.
Yes.
And here you have this whole idea of this redemption,
Sure.
restoration happening in the 7,000
Yeah.
year period. Maybe it seems
Yep.
to God as 7 days when
Yeah.
his creation will be restored to him.
That definitely struck me as I was reading it. That's another part of it that kind of struck me was, that him saying that the 7 years seemed like 7 days, and it's made me think of 1 Peter, where it's like 1,000 days is as a year, and a year is as 1,000 days. I said that backwards, but yes, it made me think of that.
It makes me think of, from Rachel's point of view, she had to know that he was working that 7 years.
She was probably
To be
just a
married
kid
to
when
her.
he got there.
I assume so.
Well, she was able to take care of at the well.
True, but that's not terribly uncommon for a young girl to be taking care of sheep.
And they
Well,
got
I
married
know.
When I was 14, 15
But-
years old. No moments.
But then, what she must have thought when her father started being a shyster that way at the day of the wedding, she must have found out.
Oh goodness,
I bet
dead.
she was some upset.
Well,
I would've told my
towards
sister.
the end of this Torah portion, when Jacob takes those sisters out and their attitude,
Yeah.
he says Laban has done, and they're like, yeah, they are not
yeah.
happy with their father.
No, they're not. And we're getting there. You don't want to jump ahead to
And I
that,
never
because
stopped
yeah,
and thought until, I don't know, just in the last couple of years, I really thought about it, that Rachel took her dad's idols. It never occurred to me. They weren't worshipers of God. They had idols and stuff. And here she was married to him, and he didn't know that she
yeah, it's weird.
worshipped idols.
It's weird. Yeah, and we'll deal with that. That's a very good question.
Which was more to the grafting with the boy.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we'll deal with that in a moment. We're coming to it. But in regard to the 7 years of service, attitude being everything, it's a really critical point. And of course, unfortunately, Jacob it's real clear to see that Jacob is experiencing, happening to him, exactly what he had done to his own father, and pretending to be Esav and putting the goat skins on his arms and his neck, that he is now being corrected by a fool, which is a terrible thing, to be corrected by a fool, because Laban is a fool. You know that Laban means white, and if you flip the letters in his name, it becomes what? Nabal. Remember that? Remember that guy that David met, and he refused to feed his troops? His name was Nabal. It means fool. Laban is a fool, And he is correcting Jacob by switching out Leah for Rachel. And you can tell specifically what's going on here. And it's also curious to me because it says that when there was a phrase in the text in verse 20, in chapter 28, when Jacob first arrives to Uncle Laban, it says that he went and he told him all, or something to that effect. And I thought, did he really tell Uncle Laban everything that had happened and why he was there? I mean, I'm assuming that he had to make some explanation because whereas Laban has some experience with the family of Abraham. He saw, when he was younger, obviously, Eliezer show up with 10 camel loads of wealth, and now Jacob comes stumbling out of the desert with nothing but the staff in his hand. How is Jacob going to explain this? I'm here to find a wife, but I've brought nothing with me. He has no dowry. He has nothing except the clothes on his back and the staff in his hand. So is it possible that he did tell Uncle Laban about his troubles at home in order to, explain why he's here with nothing? It certainly does.
But that's why he was willing to work.
Yeah.
To give her father a
That's
dowry.
right. But is that also why Laban then turned this whole tables on him and said, and used the interesting word, we don't do that around here, to give the younger before the firstborn. Use the same words regarding what Jacob had done to get the blessing of the firstborn by stealing Esau's blessing. Laban uses the same language against him and says, we don't do that around here. I think it was a rebuke, and I think that he did it because he knew he could, that there's nothing Jacob could do, and he's going to poke his conscience at the same time, which is, and he has literally been corrected by a fool. This also reminds me, unfortunately, that there's a delicate balance between, coming to Yeshua and having your sins forgiven and not having to pay the penalty for those sins. Because, there's a lot of talk about Yeshua paying the penalty and he hung on the cross in order to pay for your sins. Does that mean that the consequences of your sins are taken away? That you don't suffer any consequences? I go and I don't come to Yeshua until I'm 50 years old and I've committed a whole bunch of atrocities behind me, and I come to Yeshua, I come to the foot of the cross and I cross my hands and I say the prayer and I get serious about God in my life and I accept Yeshua. Are all the consequences of my past sins gone? No, they're not. The eternal consequences of my sins are gone. The spiritual consequences, death, spiritual death, separation from God are gone. But the temporal consequences of what I've done are not gone. If I've committed a felony or something, the law is not going to say, oh, good for you, you've become a Christian. Well, your sentence is commuted. Yeah, we'd all be Christians if that was the case.
And the effects that what you've done has on your children.
Sure.
That can't just totally go away.
No. So this does remind me, unfortunately, that everything that you do comes back. You do pay. You're going to pay. There's no question about it. God set forth almost like the law of gravity, that there's a consequence, that there's an equal and opposite reaction. And we know that the effects of sin are great and they ripple out and they affect everything around you. I don't know that because we have mitigated and watered down the Torah of God for so long, that we have a real conscientiousness about sin. And that we have kind of, unfortunately, put it off into a corner somewhere. And I think, unfortunately, you see a lot of Christians whose lives are just a miserable wreck, shipwrecked, and they don't quite understand why. And many are doubting God and losing their faith because they don't understand, why is my life such a miserable wreck if I have Jesus in my life? Why isn't God pouring on me all these wonderful blessings that I read about in the New Testament? If I'm a believer and God is with me, why am I experiencing all this misery? Hold on, Jerry. Angela?
Well, you said, the first time that
Mhm.
Abraham came on the camels to get that bride.
Yes.
This time, like Grace said, the dowry is he has to work. He has to work 7 times, almost 3, which is that number of transition or
Yeah.
moving from one place to another.
That's a great insight. I like that.
I think that because of what he did, now the dowry, he's going to have to work for her.
Sure. It's good contrast is that, the father shows up, the wealth of the father is provided for the first one with Eliezer, but this one, he has to work. That does speak about our
But this one
different
is
role.
productive.
It is productive. It's very productive. Yes, it is. Absolutely. Jerry?
I think most of these Christians, including myself, when I was back in that situation, they'd never read the Torah.
Yeah.
And if they got to the book of Deuteronomy,
Mm-hmm.
I said, this is the blessings and this is the curses.
Yeah. Yep.
Hey, a light would go off.
Sure. Yeah, it really would.
And I think
Or it should anyways.
it didn't have a whole lot to do with guilt and innocence. It had to do with honor and shame.
Well,
Sure.
everything in the Bible is honor and shame. There's nothing
Sure.
about guilt and innocence.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, I
It's an
think
honor and shame society.
yeah.
I think a lot of people jump on board when they're at their lowest because Christianity says you've done all this bad stuff, just accept Jesus and all
Yeah.
that goes away, and that is not.
That's not entirely true.
accurate.
A lot goes away, and it can really take a weight off. And the spiritual lifting of heaviness can definitely be felt and is powerful and motivating.
Yeah,
But
if
it doesn't
we're there
mitigate-
just to
It doesn't mitigate the consequences of
yeah.
your sin. Yeah. And so I hope that many of us who are studying what the Bible actually says and are taking careful note that it says, hey, if you do this, you'll get this. And if you do that, you'll get that. That we're actually thinking to ourselves, wow, I guess God is speaking truth here. These things are very real. And hopefully it's bringing to helping us to be very conscientious about the sin in our lives. I have mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again, that, when I first began to, get involved in a Torah walk, that, people would obviously say to me, oh, you're trying to work out your salvation by works. And I was like, no, I'm not. In fact, when I began to read the Torah, the first initial reaction, which stuck with me for some time, was a tremendous sense of guilt. That I was suddenly very much aware of what I had not understood before, which is sin is serious business. It is all here very clearly delineated for you, what is right and what is wrong. There are consequences. And I became very keenly aware of all of my depravity. And it drove me to Yeshua even further. It helped me to appreciate him, helped me to understand what he had really done, because it didn't make me think, oh, okay, yeah, this sucks, but now I can just keep the Sabbath and it's all taken care of. There's nothing in the Torah that says you can, have all these sins taken away and all these problems will go away if you just make this sacrifice, or if you observe the Sabbath, or if you stop eating pigs. It doesn't say anything like that.
But it says blessings.
It does say blessings. It absolutely does. But for the sins that I had been committing my whole life, it made me keenly aware of those and of my need for Yeshua, just in a big, big way. So, absolutely, the consequences are there. Oftentimes they're delayed, and I think, unfortunately, sometimes the consequences can be delayed to such an extent that we might think we gotten away with something.
Yeah.
Angela?
David, when he did that thing with Bathsheba and then had the guy killed, when the prophet pointed it at Nathan, pointed it
Yeah.
out to him, he knew. He just threw himself on the mercy
Mm-hmm.
of God. And, David, man after God's own heart, there were still consequences. Think about what happened with his sons and that whole thing. And then
God said, the sword will not leave your house.
He almost lost his kingdom.
And
his
then after
kingship.
Solomon, the whole kingdom is divided. So there was still fallout.
Yeah. There was still tremendous fallout from the sin in David's life. But that is so encouraging to me, to look at God call David a man after his own heart, and yet making such stupid blunders. It just makes me feel right at home. And I look at...
I think understanding
It's a big part of
you
it.
from continuing to do it.
We hope.
We have to be afraid of something, or we'll just
Yeah. You'll throw caution to the wind if you don't have some fear in you.
do
Yeah.
whatever we want.
Absolutely. You're right. You're absolutely right. So, it says in the text that, Leah, God saw that Leah was hated, and he opened up her womb and gave her tons of children. But it says that he closed the womb of Rachel, which brought a thought to my mind, and you let me know if you agree, disagree, or have any comments or ideas about this. It says here that because it says, almost seems like that God is saying, I see that you are hated and you're having a difficult time. Blessings. I see that you are loved and you are favored, withholding blessings. Not curses, but withholding blessings for a time. What do you make of that? That this wife, now the rabbis have said that Leah was a godly woman. Maybe was involved in some idolatry previously, but was intensely religious and potentially was moving towards Jacob's God and was faithful to God. When she starts naming her children, she uses God's name, Yehovah, in pronouncing blessings for her children. The rabbis say that she was a godly woman, but that Rachel was not. She was a worldly woman, a beautiful worldly woman, whereas Leah was a homely, godly woman. And that God saw this, and that he blessed her because of it, but withheld blessing from Rachel because of it. Does that make sense to you in any way? Does that fit? There was one sense in which that kind of fit to me, which is, do you have space for a blessing? If it reminded me of Yeshua talking about the empty being filled and the full being emptied, where Rachel had everything that she wanted. She was beautiful, loved by her husband, was chosen over her older sister. Things were looking really good for her until what she wanted she didn't get. And she became kind of bitter and began to be a little nasty with her sister. And it seems like the competition is definitely going both ways, and yet Rachel seems to be particularly bitter about it.
She had everything. She could have been gracious.
She could have been gracious. She certainly doesn't seem like she was.
It reminds me of the story of Job.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
She had everything.
Yep.
And it wasn't that he was necessarily sinning.
Right. Right.
But
Yes. It's a difficult idea to ponder, but it made me think that, there's something to the idea maybe of not knowing how to handle blessings. We're particularly bad at that when things are going well for us, we forget God lickety-split. His people have a history of doing that. And he prophesied it right in the very beginning in the Torah when he says, the days are going to come when you guys will be fat and sassy and you'll have everything you need and you'll forget that I am your God. You see that same principle here where you've got this one woman who is feeling empty and unfulfilled and is in need. She doesn't have love from her husband. It literally says he hated her. Now, that's a harsh phrase, but that's the Hebrew word. Rachel was loved, but Leah was hated. It's tough. Did he literally hate his wife? I don't know.
It means love less.
Well, yeah, loved less. It's certainly possible.
Just
The
have
comparison
Jacob was loved and Esau was hated.
We did just have, yeah. So what is going on here exactly? I'm not certain, but what I can say is that she was empty, and God filled her. Rachel was full, and God did not fill her. And it just made me think of the idea of us not being particularly equipped to handle blessings very well, that we become complacent rather quickly when we have our needs met, and we've got our hands full of blessings, and God is wanting us to either wanting to give us more blessings, but we can't take more blessings because we can't hold them. You know what I'm saying? We don't have the capacity to hold them. And I was,
We're not using that.
we're not using it
Bless
correctly.
other people, but
Absolutely. Then, that's another, I was going to bring this up later, and I'll just bring it up now. It's okay. It's applicable here. In the Hebrews, my understanding is that there is no Hebrew word or phrase that describes you having, owning, possessing something. The way it's constructed in the language, it's like this to you, this was to him, this thing was to her. It doesn't really have the expression of it is his, he holds it, it is his possession, it's his, it's in his possession. It's almost like the Bible and the Hebrew language and the whole principles that God is showing is that he doesn't anticipate, he doesn't desire for his people to be vessels to hold blessings, but conduits to transmit blessings. That if you are receiving blessings from God and your arms are full, he's saying, I can't give you any more. You have become complacent and you've been holding on to what I'm giving you. You're supposed to be passing it along. Pay it forward, pass it along. You empty your hands of what you've got and I'll keep filling them. But if you're full, I can't give you anything. If you're empty and you're holding your hands out to me, I'll give you, I will help you. This is the principle that seemed to me that was being talked about here in regards to Leah and Rachel. It was interesting.
Well, maybe you need to lose some blessings sometimes to be sharpened more spiritually. Agreed, absolutely, yeah. We become rather dull spiritually when our material blessings are in place. We've definitely become complacent. Angela, can you come closer?
It's hard to understand. I have to be reminded by being put in a position every once in a while to actually feel someone else's pain. Not just feel their pain, but actually be in their circumstance and go, ouch. I should have, when that person had this problem that I now have, I should have
been more
compassionate.
compassionate.
What I understand now. Like my parents went through some money problems, and I'll just put on a credit card. You just always have money. No, you don't. Sometimes you just don't. And it wasn't until I just didn't that I'm like, that was a tough situation. I wish I had understood better. But sometimes we can't until we're put in that position. I think sometimes that's why we're put in these positions with pain, is because you just need to understand. When someone comes along in your life, you need to be able to feel that or have felt that.
I've heard other people talk about that too. It's like, I heard a guy talking about that once where he was like, he seemed to be describing a situation where he was in incredible physical pain. And it came and stayed for a couple of months and then just disappeared. And he never understood why. But he said that God spoke to him, not in an audible voice or something, but God showed him that he needed to experience this pain so that he could help people in pain. And that was the purpose of it. That he went through a short period of intense pain. I think it was back pain or something that was just debilitating and crippling. But he said that he firmly believed that God showed him that so that he could not commiserate, but have compassion and empathize with people who are in pain. And that's, I think Angela's right in a very real sense that unfortunately we just become numb spiritually to people around us, and that we need to have our senses awakened. And there's nothing like pain and discomfort and challenges that sharpen our spiritual senses.
Experience is the best teacher.
Experience is the best teacher, yes, unfortunately. So the baby wars. This is a fascinating section. This really reminds me of the book of James, where it says that, you adulterers, don't you know that the friendship with the world is hostility towards God? You ask and you do not receive because you ask with wrong motive. Well, you don't have because you don't ask. And when you do ask, you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives. And this is where I bring in some ideas regarding what I call attribution. Do you guys know what the word attribution means? To attribute something. It means What's the source? This section, who gets the credit? Yes. It's like if you're quoting somebody in a research paper or something, you have to attribute it to them, so they get credit for it. This section is full of mis-attribution, and you will see that it has some serious consequences. For example, in regard to the baby wars, Rachel doesn't have children. Doesn't say that, like when we read with the last Torah portion, when Isaac's wife Rebecca didn't have children, it says Isaac prayed for her and she had children. Doesn't say how long he waited or anything, but it does seem that there was prayer there. There's no prayer mentioned in this section. It's like Rachel is not having any children, and she gets really upset, and she's not asking from God, and then she's getting upset because she's not receiving. It makes me wonder about her motives. What is her motivation? She was definitely angry. Oh, yeah, her husband was angry. Yes, he was, and that's because of mis-attribution. She says to him, "Give me children, or I'll die. I got no use to live if I don't have children." And he says to her, "Am I God who have prevented you from having children?" She is misattributing what is the source of the trouble that she's going through. She doesn't ask God, and then when she's got this attitude problem, she blames someone else. She doesn't seem to recognize who is responsible for children. It's God, period. She never heard about mandrakes, not yet.
Well, even that is a misattribution.
Even that is a Yeah, and consider this idea about misattribution, because it keeps happening over and over and over.
And the goats with the
Exactly.
peeled off
Exactly.
whatever stuff.
Yep.
But God instigated that.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
in a
that's
sense.
not, but they're misattributing what caused the
Yes.
production of goats.
Yeah, well, and she goes through an alternate means. She says, "Here, go and sleep with my handmaid. Maybe I will be built up by her." Again, misattribution.
Surrogate mother.
It's this Sarah Hagar thing all over again. Maybe, but the way that she says it is particularly egregious, because she says, "Maybe this woman will build up my house." Who? I mean, you got to assume that Jacob was telling his wives, man, all the way back since my grandfather, the God who created this place has been appearing to them and saying, "Children like the sand of the sea." And what is she saying? I may be built up by her, this slave girl. And later on, she's like, "Give me mandrakes." She's got this myopic view of being in charge, or who's in charge of me having children. Yeah.
They don't really believe them.
They don't really believe the promises, yes. And it's fascinating. But you got another case of misattribution. What should she have done? What do you say?
Got rid of her idols and got to God.
Well, it doesn't specifically say that she has idols at this time in her life.
Well,
And I don't know that.
Home. She took her father's, so then that's where they were.
Well, that doesn't come until later.
I know.
And I don't know that I personally don't know that she stole her father's idols because she intended to worship them. That's not my understanding of that. It's certainly possible. It's not improbable. But I don't know that I think that that's the purpose behind that. I'll talk about that in a second. But I think clearly what she should have done was been patient. She certainly should have been gracious to her sister instead of being just viciously, aggressively competing. I mean, she could have been a blessing to her sister. God bless you, you're having children, let me babysit, whatever. She could have been a blessing to her sister. She certainly was not that.
So we already have a divided.
We've already got a divided kingdom. It would have been very interesting if the children had been divided exactly like they were later. It would have been fascinating. It's not quite that way. But, yeah,
She had everything. She wasn't used to not having something.
Yeah,
I would suppose that that if that's her attitude and her personality, she's been hateful to Leah for years.
It's certainly possible that she was a spoiled, rotten brat. Yeah, absolutely.
And he fell
Daddy's
in love with her
favorite.
looks.
Yeah, he did. And unfortunately, us men are kind of dumb that way. We get shiny apples in front of us and we say, "Woo, I like shiny apples." Is that right, Larry? You like shiny apples?
I like you said, it's kind of a natural.
It is, unfortunately. So she could have and should have behaved herself a little bit better. But God, it does say that God remembered Rachel after some period of time had passed and her sister had been spitting out kids and her handmaid had spit out a baby or two. It says that God remembered Rachel. Fascinating, it says that he took away her reproach, which is the Hebrew word charaf, which can be interpreted as blasphemy. And I thought about that, and I thought, God remembered Rachel and took away her blasphemy, removed the sin of blasphemy from her, enabled her to get babies. I'm not sure. It was quite interesting, and it occurred to me, was she guilty of blasphemy? What is blasphemy anyway?
Untruthful speaking.
Okay.
Towards God.
Think about what you understand regarding blasphemy, and how does that tie in with what we've been talking about here?
It ties to mis-attribution.
It ties directly into mis-attribution, attributing the work of God to the adversary, to evil.
I mean, Jacob told her
Mm-hmm.
where they're coming from,
Yes, he did.
and which would be the same, I think, as saying, why don't you pray to him? Why don't you ask him?
Yeah.
I don't know why he didn't offer to ask him with her,
Don't know.
but yeah,
Maybe
either
he did,
way.
but it's not recorded.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
But she seems to me have directly turned her snotty little nose up at it and gone everywhere else,
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
approach God about it,
Unfortunately, yeah, I would have to agree with that.
fighting oneself.
And it could be that charaf is exactly what she was guilty of: blasphemy, of false attribution of the works of God to something else. It's certainly possible. So that's fascinating that you keep seeing this thing. Dealing with the world, you can see that in verse 30, chapter 30, verse 27. I want to read that to you. It's quite interesting. Chapter 30, verse 27 says, that Laban said to Jacob, "Stay with me." Because he's like, "Hey, give me my wives. I'm ready to get out of here and go back to my hometown," And he's like, "Stay with me. I pray thee, if I have found favor in your eyes. I have discovered that Yehovah has been blessing me for your sake." There's a correct attribution. How was that correct attribution arrived at? That's a very interesting thing. The Hebrew word here says that Laban found out about this amazing thing that he has been experiencing. He used or learned this through nakashti, which is the practice of divination. Have you ever heard the word you recognize something in that word? Nakashti? Snake.
Narcotics?
Nakash. Interesting idea. But nakash is the Hebrew word for snake, serpent.
Oh, okay.
He says, "I have learned through nakashti that God is blessing me because of you." That literally means the occult, a snake spirit. A snake spirit told me that your God has been blessing me because of you. Angela?
That's the same word used to describe Joseph's cup.
Interesting.
That Benjamin is accused of taking.
Yep.
That divination cup.
Yep. It's also the word used to describe the serpent in the garden.
In the LTV, LITV, Little Intent, whatever translation,
Mm-hmm.
it says, "I have seen omens. Also, Jehovah has blessed me because of you." But when I go over the King James Version, comparing with the meaning of the words, it says, "by experience."
Yeah. Yeah, in my Hebrew interlinear it says by experience. Yeah, absolutely.
When you go over to the Strong's thing, it says primitive root properly to hiss.
Yeah.
Whisper.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. And it's interesting to me that we did what the rabbis do and make excuses for people because it didn't exactly fit our narrative. When we looked at Joseph and his cup of divination, we chose to interpret that as I have learned by experience. Now, I don't want to attribute occultism to Joseph because you look at the life of Joseph and you're like, man, that guy didn't do anything wrong. But that may not be exactly the case. There's no...
Where are you talking about?
Well, when he says that he was entertaining his brothers and before he revealed himself to his brothers, that he put that cup in Benjamin's sack, and he says, I've learned, this is the cup where's my cup that I use for divination?
I never thought of that.
And we thought to ourselves, what in the heck is that? Is this perfect picture of the Messiah be engaged in divination?
Well, the other two places it's used in the Torah are in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, saying you should not use enchantments, and then in Deuteronomy, talking about an enchanter.
Yeah.
So this is kind of witchcraft type of.
So was Joseph involved in witchcraft? It is certainly
What
possible.
was his purpose on that?
Whose?
Joseph.
Well, I don't know. I think that he was trying... That was one of the things that we looked at when we studied the book of Genesis at the end of it a couple of years back was under what context was he speaking about that when he was talking about this cup of divination?
4 times.
Yeah, it seemed at the time like he was trying he was playing with his brothers. They didn't yet know who he was. And it's almost like he was playing with them and trying to convince them that he had secret knowledge because he knew who they were and he knew what they had done, but they didn't know who he was. So he used that to his advantage and said, oh, my cup of divination, but that he really wasn't using a cup of divination. Maybe he phrased it that way because it would have made sense to them. Oh, yeah, this guy's a pagan, and of course he has a cup of divination, and he knows things about us. What's that?
For more disguise.
Yeah, it kind of furthered his disguise,
Well, he gives an explanation as to why he would know certain things about them, other than
Yeah,
Joseph.
right. That gives context to why he would know things about them. Yeah. So we kind
I
of...
wonder when he's supposed to be a picture of
Right.
the Messiah.
And that's why we gave him a pass. But
I wonder why the Lord allowed it in His Word.
Well, and I think we just have to read it critically and we have to decide, is it possible
It was
that...
a picture of Christ, but
Sure.
He was not perfect.
Well, there is no...
It's coupled up. There's twice in one verse, and then just a few verses later, it's twice again. 10 verses later, it's twice again in the same verse.
Yeah,
So I'm betting if you look at a pattern,
might be a
there
chiasm
might
there.
be something in the
Yeah, there's
middle.
certainly possible. But, it's certainly possible that Joseph was... There are very good pictures of the Messiah in the Scripture, but they are human pictures. So is it possible that he was not perfect? Of course. Is it possible that he actually did practice divination? Yeah, it absolutely is possible. He seems to be a very righteous individual, and yet he lives in the court of Pharaoh for God knows how long.
There are other figures.
Hold on, Jerry.
Okay, this is moving on a little bit, but when the high priest come into existence, they would see God, or I say we want an answer, whatever, and if they couldn't get a word from God, they had
Those stones.
those stones
Sure.
or something that they threw. I
Yeah.
call them dice.
Sure.
And they rolled the dice to see what God's answer was. Now, is that divination?
It clearly is.
Same thing when they picked the new disciple, Matthias. They
Absolutely.
rolled the dice.
Yeah, the casting of lots and those...
Is that, I don't know if that's divination.
That is very much...
I don't know what divination technically is.
I don't either.
Well, here's the thing, though. I think that the source is the issue. The source is the issue.
Yeah.
The source is mis-attribution. There you go. So if you're casting dice or looking at stones or reading chicken guts or, looking at the bottom of a teacup and you're expecting an answer from somewhere other than here, It's mis-attribution.
Joseph's source, when he interpreted the dreams, his source for the information about his brothers, all that was true.
Yes.
So he could have had a cup that others had used to try to get information from evil spirits, but for Joseph,
There's an interesting idea, is that would it be inappropriate for Joseph to use a cup of divination to receive messages from God? If the priests can throw dice and receive messages from God, would it be inappropriate for Joseph to use some other thing, some other physical talisman to receive messages from God? That's a difficult one, and I'm not willing to, lay my hat on that, but it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
I think there are a lot of, I really believe, and I say it cautiously because I don't think it is covered all, that there are times when the Lord allows for our lack of understanding or our lack of
Mm-hmm.
not knowing that He can, but
Sure.
trusting that you really see what He's saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you can look no further than Balaam
Yeah.
to see that. I mean, this is a prophet who heard directly from
I
God.
think at this point God had made a big clear thing over that stuff. Like it hadn't been like when the king Saul went to the sorcerers.
Right,
or whatever.
right.
And by then it had been really clearly
Right.
stated.
Yeah, and I totally am picking up on your idea that the people of God are young and like children in
They
this
don't
part.
have everything there. Like,
Yeah, and he's
their
willing to
history was
be.
just growing.
Yeah, he's willing to be more gracious with them as they're learning, just like you are with your own children, to be more gracious with them.
Another thought I've got is just how much did Jacob's kids know about God? I mean, Jacob he sat at his mother's and father's feet for 70 years,
Mhm.
whatever. So he should have known quite a bit. But did he pass any of that on to his kids, to his two wives,
Yeah,
Laban?
yeah.
I mean, were they just as pagan 20 years later as when they started?
That's a good question, and there are so few examples in the Torah of men inculcating the principles of God in their children. So few examples of that.
Then you see some that it had to have been because look at Moses
Abraham must
and
have
his
to
mom
Isaac.
and dad knowing
Yeah.
to disobey the
We have several examples of men failing to inculcate these principles. Godly men who just seemingly didn't teach it to their children. But you also have to give this idea some credence, and that is that you don't know what's happening with your children. You can fill them full of the knowledge of God, and they can walk right away from it. You've seen it many times, where children who are born in a Christian household and such just go off and walk the ways of the world and never come
At
back.
least we have the Holy Spirit indwelling. They didn't have the Holy Spirit indwelling back then.
Yeah, that's also that idea too.
You know,
Yeah.
still human nature.
Yeah. So Laban, what's that?
I don't know.
Yeah, no. So Laban definitely appears to be dabbling in the occult. He does make a great deal with Jacob regarding this. Hey man, I need to build a wealth for my own family. I've been working for you for 14 years, and you have become wealthy, and you got sheep coming at your ears, but I got nothing. I got these children that are starting to come and multiple wives. I need to start building my own empire. And so he makes a deal with Laban to say, okay, I will give you, I don't want you to give me anything, which is interesting because that's exactly what Abraham said to the king of Sodom, who said, give me the people and you take the wealth. He says, I don't want you giving me anything. In fact, my payment will be all of the sheep which are speckled and spotted and the goats which are speckled and spotted. I want you to go through the flock right now and take out any lamb or sheep that is not pure white. And I want you to go and take of the goats any that is not pure black. So I will have left all of your flocks that have nothing but white and black. And you take anything that's mixed, give them to your sons, and send them 3 days' journey away. Now,
Was that God speaking to Abraham?
no, this is Jacob telling Laban how we're going to work this deal where I'm going to get paid, okay? So we're going to have all of the speckled and spotted and streaked and mottled goats and sheep taken away with your other sons, 3 days journey away from here. I'm going to be left taking care of your sheep and goats, but they're only going to be white and black. Anything that happens to come out mottled, which is an unlikelihood just based on genetics, So he is now willing to give a proper attribution. Seemingly.
I thought they made the deal and then Lavan took.
The text almost seems to suggest that there's some kind of chicanery going on with Laban going through the flock and pulling out anything that Jacob could have been paid. I no longer believe that. So that there would be little chance of them.
Right,
yeah,
right.
no, I don't. No, I don't believe that that's the case. My examination of the text a little closer seemed to suggest that this was Jacob saying, "Go through the flock and take out everything that gives me an advantage."
Okay.
So that he said, "You take them," so that what's left is like almost no. And that's why when Jacob proposes this deal to Lavan, you can see what Lavan says in the text is, "Oh, behold, if only it would happen as you have suggested." He is delighted. He knows that he has made a tremendous deal and that Jacob is at a distinct advantage. But Jacob seems to put himself at this distinct advantage on purpose. Disadvantage, excuse me, yes. So, yeah, he has...
God makes himself known.
That is how God makes himself known.
Know you're barren.
Absolutely.
He can show you.
Absolutely. This seems to have been a great act of faith on Jacob's part, but I want to modify that slightly because he seems to have great faith in saying, I want you to remove any possible advantage I could have here, and anything now that is speckled or spotted or whatever, that's going to be my payment. But what does he do in the very next section? He's stripping the bark off of trees, thinking that he's got some cool little... he's got some kind of little talisman that he's setting up, thinks that he's going to have an influence on this thing. He doesn't get disabused of that notion until the next chapter where God says, "Behold, do you see all those speckled and spotted sheep? That was not you and your sticks. That was me." I think he learned about that later, after another 6 years. But I think he thought that he could have some influence on it, or possibly maybe that was a talisman of his faith. Who knows? But it sure seems like he's thinking he's affecting the outcome in some way. I don't think so. It's interesting that what this sequence might teach us about our interaction with this world and how we live in this world. Just because of the way that we can get taken advantage of by people, what our attitude should be when we maybe get taken advantage of by people, that God says, and in the New Testament it says too, wouldn't you rather be wronged than fight amongst yourselves and fight for your rights? Just rather be wronged, because if you suffer for the sake of righteousness, you get a blessing. Yeah. So I think that this teaches us about that a little bit. And now here we have the clear principle of I will bless those that bless you and I will curse those who curse you, because he ends up taking all of Laban's sheep. There are a whole ton of them. It seems to me that all of these animals keep pumping out speckled and spotted animals, and Laban's herd of pure black ones and pure white ones shrink down to nothing practically. This is a large-scale wealth transfer. This is a large-scale wealth transfer where Jacob ends up with a huge chunk of the money that Laban used to have, which is pretty cool. I've already discussed that. And then I just want to bring this one final thing to your attention, which I think was kind of interesting, and it'll lead into our next Torah portion, which is right at the beginning of chapter 32. It says that when Jacob leaves after having made this covenant with Laban to not do harm to each other, that he comes to this place called Mahanaim, which means two camps. And it says that he sees the angels of God, an encampment of them. It almost reminds me of Elisha or Elijah. I don't remember which one it was.
Ezekiel.
Well, where Elijah says to his servant, "Open his eyes so that he can see," and all of a sudden he sees like a whole army of angels. Yeah, so this kind of reminds me of that because Jacob comes to a place and he sees the angels of God, and literally what it says is Jacob went on his way and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is the camp of God." And he called the name of that place Mahanaim, which means two camps, his own camp and the camp of God, which is fascinating for a couple of different reasons. Primarily an interesting thing regarding, it says that in the very next verse, which starts our next Torah portion, I'm just going to kind of hint to this before we wrap up for the evening. It says, Jacob sent messengers before his face to Esau, his brother. Remember, he loads up gifts and sends messengers to greet his brother. Did you know it's the same Hebrew word? Angels, messengers.
Messenger could be a man
He
or woman.
just met the messengers of God. This Darby translation says angels, and then certain other things say messengers. But it's the same Hebrew word. And this is why the many Hebrew scholars and the Chazal, which means the sages of old, have said that when Jacob sent messengers to meet his brother Esau, it's talking about angels. That somehow he had the command of God's angels to send and meet with his brother Esau, which is a fascinating idea because in the Hebrew it literally said, and Jacob went on his way and he met messengers from God. And when he saw them, he said, "This is the camp of God." And Jacob sent messengers before his face to his brother Esau to meet him in the land of Seir. Fascinating idea. It's an interesting idea, but we'll talk about that maybe briefly when we start our next section. Do you have any comments, questions, or concerns? I'm sure you have a whole ton of them. This has been a wild ride through a very large section of Scripture.
You know, I'm just curious now, on the 12 tribes, the mother, Leah, mothered 10 of them.
8.
8 of them?
There's 6 herself. 6 herself.
2 from another father.
And 6 herself.
No, Leah had 6 of the children herself. Rachel had 2.
And the 2
That's 8.
concubines had 2 each.
And then,
there we go.
yeah, the concubines had theirs, so altogether you get 12. Yeah.
Leah had 4, then concubines had 4.
And then Leah had an additional 2.
Then they had 2 more.
Then Rachel had.
And then Bilhah had a couple, and then Rachel had 2. Yeah. Rachel had
She
2.
didn't have the second one until after they got back to Canaan.
And she died giving birth to that second one. Yeah. Angela?
Yeah, and that I think is tied to the idols because she
It is. That's
I
the
agree.
verse.
I agree.
Because Jacob went and said, "If anyone has that, they won't live."
Yeah. Yeah, that's the
She died
problem.
giving birth
She
to-
died giving birth to Benjamin.
Yeah, but remember right before the study, I was telling you that Laban,
Yeah.
is bricks,
White bricks, yes.
bricks, and then the 2 other times that's used. Well, it might be more, but there's 2 times that's used. It's the bricks they used to make the Tower of Babel.
Mm-hmm.
It's Laban. It's the same as Laban,
Mm-hmm.
same word. And the other time was when they were in Egypt making bricks.
Yeah.
They were making Laban.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what is the tie between these? And then throughout our discussion here, that Nakashti thing came up, and that kind of tied in what Laban was doing to what Joseph was doing in Egypt. And so what you had was, they were using Laban's to build the tower in Babel, which meant the gate of God. And then Jacob, we come to Jacob, and he sees the ladder, and he said, "Surely this is the gate to heaven." And then he meets up with Laban. You have the whole Rachel incident. You have Laban practicing that Nakashti for property, which actually he properly attributes that God is the one that is blessing Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
Then you skip to Egypt, and you have Joseph practicing the same thing, which ends up pulling all the brothers plus Benjamin. Because remember, the cup specifically pulled Benjamin back
Yeah.
to
Right.
Egypt because he wanted Benjamin there.
Yeah.
Benjamin is Rachel's son, that one that she had after she died, while she died, the whole idols incident.
Mm-hmm.
So Benjamin, there's something special about Benjamin.
Absolutely.
And then all those tribes that got pulled into Egypt, what did they end up making generations later?
Bronze serpent.
Levans.
Bricks.
Oh, bricks. Yes. Yeah. Fascinating. Fascinating. Anyway, let us pray and we'll roll.